let's start. I'm only gonna talk a little bit about this current topic right now, and then we'll finish it tomorrow. So the way that this chapter is designed here, this is chapter 10. This chapter is divided into three parts. There's the axial skeleton, the pectoral girdle, and the pelvic girdle. And so then that's what we'll be talking about over the next over the next 2 days. So the start of each of these three lecture series are the same, and that's what I'm going to talk about today in terms of I won't really worry about the learning outcomes. This should be a familiar view from last week, judging from the practical, right? The mini practical. When we're talking about skeletal muscle anatomy, there's some basic vocabulary and basic principles here that I really want to focus on today, and then there'll be for the rest of this week I will ignore them. I'll be using some of those terms, but I won't be talking about them specifically. So in terms of the terminology associated with muscles here, there is the origin, insertion, and action, in addition to the location here. So the origin and the insertion. The origin, generally speaking, is superior, proximal, medial, and immobile. That's the origin. The insertion is inferior, distal, lateral, and mobile. The one thing that is always consistent here is the origin is immobile, the insertion is mobile. So no matter what, I'm going to show you some examples of when those rules don't apply. And the first muscle I'll talk about today is an example of when the rule doesn't apply. And the majority of these rules, the rules do apply in terms of the origin and insertion. In terms of the term head or belly, I'm not as worried about the head or the belly of the muscles there, so origin and insertion is very important. Last week we talked about aponeuroses a little bit, and there's two examples of aponeuroses you need to know of. There are others present on the body as well, but there's the epicranial aponeurosis and the linea alba. The epicranial aponeurosis is on top of the head. The linea alba is right down the midline of the body in the abdomen. Things that I don't spend a lot of time talking about here are these next terms, but you need to understand them because they will inform you when I ask questions about these muscles. So for instance, if you had talked about an agonist or an antagonist here, an agonist is an example of a muscle that is causing an action, and an antagonist, those words look familiar or similar. An antagonist is that a muscle is working in opposition to another muscle, or one group of muscles is working. Do you guys have questions? One group of muscles is working in opposition to another group. So an antagonist, simplest one, the biceps brachii is contracting. The antagonist is the triceps brachii. Now, another example of just considering the forearm there deals with synergists, prime movers, and fixators, but in particular, synergists and prime movers. When you're talking about flexion of the forearm, when you're talking about the contraction of the biceps brachii, there are other muscles that help with it. And those muscles are the brachialis and the brachioradialis. So all three of those form a group, and these are muscles that will be synergists that work together, but of those three, the prime mover is the biceps brachii. So there's that. The final thing is that you'll also see examples of muscles that are called fixators. And so far, what I've really said to you is that skeletal muscles produce movement, right? But you want to have coordinated movement. You don't want to have uncoordinated movement. That's not really terribly effective. So, for instance, if you were in a pool and you're floating, and then you try to run, but you're moving your arms back and forth. Literally, you're standing up like this, and you're moving your arms back and forth like this, and then you're moving your legs like you're normally running. Are you going to be moving in one direction? No, because as you move your hands this way and that way, you're going to be producing movement and forward and back, and you're not really going to be producing anything, right? Sometimes muscles will do that same thing. They produce movement, but they in the form of stabilization, not movement necessarily. And that helps coordination. So if you wanted to take if I wanted to take this pen and I wanted to throw it at the wall, right? I would have to have a number of different muscles working in concert at appropriate times, but the muscles of the shoulder would be fixators, and those are called rotator cuff muscles. So there's some muscles, especially associated with the shoulder, that are fixators, and those are actions that don't produce movement but help other muscles to produce movement. And so these are, you don't want to have the whole shoulder sort of falling forward if you're just trying to throw something with your hand, or if you're just trying to move your hand forward. You want to have the joint itself stabilized. And there's lots of examples of fixators. So there's synergists, and those synergists have both prime movers and fixators, and those are different. There's antagonists and agonists, and those are different as well. If you look at this picture right here, here is a picture of one of the heads of the biceps brachii. This is the origin of one of the heads of the biceps brachii. This is the origin of the lateral or the long head of the biceps brachii, and they merge together. The two heads merge together, and they insert on the radial tuberosity. So there's the origin and the insertion. You have to know the action of both heads. Generally speaking, the action of one head is the same as the other. So for instance, in the biceps femoris and the triceps brachii, the actions are the same. What is the action here? The action is flexion. You also need to know if I show you this picture right here, what are examples of a prime mover? What would an example be of an agonist? What would an example be of an antagonist? In the context of the prime mover here, we don't have any other muscles that will help move this on this picture. This is an incomplete diagram, in other words. The reason why I don't have any other muscles that are here, I can say that, is that the brachialis is not present, and the brachioradialis, which is lateral and would be inserting right there, is not present or is not labeled. Right? So I couldn't ask you about prime movers versus agonists, but I could ask you about antagonists. So now in this muscle right here, we have the biceps brachii, and then we have a couple of examples of this might be 3 examples of the triceps brachii. In all cases, the triceps is antagonist produces an opposite movement. And in some cases, the opposite movement will also flex slightly if the arm is starting to do something that's under a lot of pressure. Right, so there's the agonist, the antagonist, prime movers, and synergists. These are all pictures of muscles that are shaped in a particular way, and their names will mean something, and you can go through these things and give me some examples. So for instance, what is an example of a muscle that looks like this? And you can see on the right-hand side, you might not be able to read it, but this is orbicularis muscles. What's an example of a muscle that's convergent? Examples of convergent muscles, very, very broad muscles. There's a couple of examples, but one that's listed here is the pectoralis major. Examples of parallel muscles. I will try to give you clear examples. So examples of parallel muscles would be the rhomboides muscles. Those are really pretty parallel. And then also the rectus abdominis. Both those are parallel. And then there's different versions of convergent muscles here. So there's pennate muscles. So basically what you're talking about here is those fibers then merge or they divide. And so some of that fascicle, and by the way, when we're talking about the level of the muscle, what are we talking about arrangements of? We're talking about arrangements of fascicles, not the entire muscle. So we're talking about, so I could show you this picture right here and say that this is a bipennate muscle, and you can tell that this is a bipennate muscle because of the level of the fascicles. Which portion of the fascicle is going to be covering it? Which layer is going to cover it? Is it the epimysium, paramysium, or endomysium? Right. So basically, I'm starting you down on one path, and I'm asking you a different question. In terms of the names themselves, they are depending upon the location, the size, the shape, the orientation, the origin, insertion, the number of heads, and whether or not there's functions here. There are adductors and abductors there. So there are abductors and adductors. I'm going to show you later on Thursday. We're going to show definitely examples of adductors, leg adductors, femur adductors, and there's a whole group there associated with that. And the name has that in it. So pay attention to those names because that helps you inform. It basically makes, if you know the reason why those names are there, it makes remembering those names easier. And then some of these names, so the size is pretty straightforward, but some of these names, the gluteal and brachial regions, some of the regions of the body, right, those are from quiz 2, right, from way, way, way back 400 years ago, from quiz 2. Anterior view, something we talked about already, right? Last week, practical. Posterior view, this week's practical. If you look, just as a reminder here, if you look at the posterior leg and the hamstrings, and you look right about where my pointer is, you see that little diamond-shaped area right here that doesn't have any muscle, that black diamond-shaped area. That black diamond-shaped area is really, really important to look at to identify either distally the gastric medius or proximally the muscles of the thigh, including the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. So the first group of muscles I'm going to talk about are these muscles of the head and neck, and then we'll go down to the abdomen and back. I'll warn you that just tell you that the abdomen to the back, there's not a lot. Let me rephrase that. There's a lot of muscles in of the back, but they all come in one group, and I'm going to group them all in one single category. And I'll tell you that pretty much a muscle that is parallel to the spinous process of the vertebrae it falls into this one group. So we're talking basically the muscles of the anterior face, neck, and abdomen are what I'm going to focus on most of them, and then when we get to the back, there'll be a couple of muscles. Okay. The reason why when I get to the back, there'll be a couple of muscles. The back is really focused on dealing with either superiorly the arm, movement of the arm and the stabilization of the arm, or the hip or the legs. And I want to just end my discussion today about this muscle right here, because this muscle is a poster child for a couple of things. First of all, what's the name of the muscle? It's the sternocleidomastoid. So, sternum, clavicle, mastoid process. Now, I said just a few minutes ago that the origin. Are you doing something? Do you want me to wait for you, or? I said that the origin is superior, proximal, medial, and immobile. And I said the insertion is distal, inferior, lateral, and mobile. Sternocleidomastoid. Now, according to those rules, this is inferior, the sternum and the clavicle. This is inferior. This is not lateral, but it's definitely inferior. And this is the origin. According to the rules, the mastoid process, which is superior and lateral, right? The superior should be the origin. Right here, it is the insertion in this muscle. So the insertion or the action here is laterally flexing the head, and then this is another example now. Especially muscles down the midline. They can work unilaterally or bilaterally. My right biceps muscle isn't going to work with my left biceps muscle unless I want to produce the same movement in both arms. Right? I have to do two things simultaneously. Right? I can do one thing simultaneously by doing this, and then doing this, or doing this, all with essentially this one muscle. Right? one on the left side, one on the right side. So the insertion for the sternocleidomastoid is the mastoid process here. The origin includes the sternum or the manubrium and the clavicle. Right? So now, I had a discussion last week with Arlen, and she was like, you know, when you get into the origin insertion, I went to the NIH, which was awesome, right? I was very impressed with her doing this. But I don't want anyone you doing this, okay? Because this is what I told her. I said, if you go online and you find multiple sources of discussions of origins, insertions, and then ultimately actions, you're going to get a lot of information. It's going to be right, and it's probably going to, it might possibly conflict with this information. I'm trying to simplify this. Okay, so when I say, so you see here this great outline right here, don't look at that right here. We're going to say the mastoid process, and that's it, right? The name. So the point here is that look in these set of lectures for the origin, insertion, and action. Don't look elsewhere. If you can't find the origin, insertion, and action in the lecture notes, then you should also have written down stuff that I've talked about, right? And you can talk to me about what the origin, insertion, and action is. And I'll show you a number of different places where you can actually find the origin, insertion, and action, and just go to the Brightspace website. Now, when you have one of the sides of muscle of the sternocleidomastoid contracting, then you get, depending on what movement you're looking at here, this is called lateral movement, right? And that is moving the right side to the right, right? So that's lateral movement, and then this is medial movement, and then there's this movement as well. When I do lateral movement or medial movement, and then lateral movement or medial, that's unilateral movement. Unilateral means one of the two sides is contracted. When you pull down like this, that's bilateral movement, and that's when both sides are contracted. So both sides are contracting, that's flexing of the neck. If you have unilateral movement, that's movement or rotating of the head. Again, now remember what we're talking about here with head rotation or movement here, and we're talking about the actions that we talked about in chapter 8, okay? So, final thing here is generally speaking, except for this example right here, the origin is going to be superior, medial, and proximal. The insertion will be inferior, lateral, and distal. But one thing is always true, is that the insertion is mobile, the origin is immobile. The final thing is that if you wanted to jump ahead, you'll see there's 3 parts to this lecture series. There's the axial skeleton, pectoral girdle, and pelvic girdle. Those are the areas where you should find origin, insertion, and action of the muscles that are found in Brightspace. Okay. So we did a lot today. Are there any questions about what we're doing tomorrow? Tomorrow we have 2 parts. We're going to finish up this section, and then we're going to talk about the pectoral girdle. Thursday we have 2 parts, the pelvic girdle, and then a review. Joanna, do you have a question?
Well, let's see what we do tomorrow, but can you answer that?
Oh, okay. I anticipated that question.